Jane, a 45-year-old woman, sat quietly in the corner of her living room, staring out the window as the evening sun cast a golden hue across the neighborhood. It was a peaceful sight, but inside, her heart was anything but calm. For the past 20 years, she had been playing the role of a wife and mother, and over time, she had lost track of who she was. The realization hit her like a wave crashing on the shore. She had lost herself in her marriage. Her world had revolved around her husband, Tom, and their 2 children, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten to take care of herself. Her identity had become entwined with the needs and desires of others, leaving no room for her own passions, dreams, or even simple pleasures. Her life had become a routine, a series of responsibilities that she dutifully fulfilled. But as the years passed, she felt the weight of the years on her shoulders. What was once a joyful partnership with Tom had turned into a predictable, almost mechanical relationship. The spark of romance had long since faded, replaced by discussions about bills, schedules, and the needs of their children. Jane couldn't even remember the last time she had done something just for herself, something that made her feel alive and connected to her own desires. It wasn't that Tom was a bad husband. In fact, he was a good man, a provider, a father, a dependable partner. But somewhere along the line, their marriage had become more about convenience and stability than about passion and connection. Tom was content with the status quo, but Jane felt an emptiness growing inside her, a feeling she couldn't shake. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Jane found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Her face, once full of hope and dreams, now looked tired and worn. Her eyes seemed distant, as if they had forgotten how to sparkle with excitement. She had become a version of herself that she didn't even recognize. That was when the thought first crossed her mind: what if I could change? What if I could find myself again? It wasn't an easy thought to entertain. Change, after all, was risky. It could mean challenging the very foundation of her life, the family, the marriage, everything she had built. But as she stood there, looking at the woman in the mirror, Jane felt a flicker of something, hope maybe, or perhaps just the faintest idea that she could still take control of her life. The decision wasn't immediate, but it began to take root in her mind. I need to find myself again. I need to live for me, not just for everyone else. For the first time in years, Jane felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. And although she didn't know what the future would hold, she knew one thing for certain: the journey to rediscover herself was about to begin. But first, she would have to face the hardest part, admitting to herself that she had lost who she was, and that finding her again would require courage, change, and most of all, a willingness to be vulnerable. The early days of Jane and Tom's relationship felt like a different lifetime. The kind of love that burns brightly, that makes the world feel alive with possibility. They had met in their late 20s, both full of ambition and dreams of building something great together. The first few years of their marriage had been filled with laughter, adventures, and late-night talks about their hopes for the future. They were a team, an inseparable pair who believed in love's power to conquer all. In those days, Jane and Tom had shared everything, every victory, every challenge, every tear and every joy. They traveled together, took risks, built their careers side by side, and started a family. The first few years of parenthood had been chaotic, but they had done it together. They were both hands-on with the kids, trying to balance work, life, and everything in between. Those early moments were filled with warmth, and Jane often reminisced about how they would sneak away for weekend trips, even if just for a few hours, to reconnect and recharge. Back then, it felt like nothing could break them apart. There was a rhythm to their lives, a comfort in knowing that they could rely on each other. Tom was her rock, steady and dependable, and Jane was his, nurturing their family and building the life they had always dreamed of. They laughed often, talked endlessly about their future, and built a life that seemed so full of promise. It was during those early years that Jane felt the most herself, confident, vibrant, and full of energy. But over the years, things began to change, slowly at first, then more rapidly. The busy routines of family life began to take their toll. The sleepless nights with a newborn, followed by the demands of raising young children, wore them both down. What had once been spontaneous adventures turned into carefully planned schedules. The joy of raising a family became overshadowed by the daily grind: work, school, groceries, bills, and everything in between. It wasn't just the responsibilities that started to change things. Somewhere along the way, Jane noticed that the small, meaningful gestures between her and Tom started to fade. The hand-holding during walks, the stolen kisses, the late-night talks about their dreams, all of that began to feel like distant memories. They became roommates, co-parents, but not lovers. Tom was still a good man, a caring father, but the emotional connection between them was slipping through their fingers. Jane tried to ignore it at first, telling herself that this was just a phase. Everyone goes through it, she thought. She threw herself into her role as a mother, focusing on the kids, on their schedules, their needs, and on making sure that everything at home ran smoothly. But as the years went by, it became harder to ignore the growing distance between her and Tom. She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when things had started to unravel, but one day, she realized that she no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. The first real sign that things had changed came when Jane found herself sitting alone on the couch one evening, while Tom was in the kitchen making dinner. She had been trying to focus on a book, but her mind kept wandering. She could hear Tom humming to himself as he cooked, but the sound didn't fill her with warmth as it once had. It was just background noise. She wasn't angry, and she wasn't sad, but there was a feeling of emptiness inside of her. It was as though they had become strangers who happened to share a life together. As Jane watched Tom move around the kitchen, chopping vegetables and setting the table, she realized something that hit her hard. They had become so used to each other that they had forgotten how to truly connect. They had stopped sharing their dreams, their fears, and their desires. They had stopped listening to each other in the way they once did. The realization was both painful and liberating. It was painful because it meant that the love they once had, the love that had felt so effortless, was now a distant memory. But it was liberating because it forced Jane to confront the truth, that something had to change if she was going to find herself again. And so, in that quiet moment, while the familiar sounds of dinner being prepared drifted through the house, Jane made a decision. She couldn't keep going through the motions of life, pretending that everything was fine when she knew deep down that something was missing. She needed to find herself again, to rediscover the woman she had once been, the woman who had dreams and passions, who had felt alive in her own skin. The first step would be the hardest, admitting to herself that the life she had built, the life she had once been so proud of, no longer felt fulfilling. It wasn't Tom's fault, and it wasn't her children's fault. It was simply a reality that Jane had to face, that over the years, she had lost sight of who she was. And now, she was determined to find her way back. The first step was the hardest, but once Jane made the decision to change, she felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The weight of the years that had passed in quiet desperation began to lift, replaced by a deep desire to reclaim her identity. For the first time in a long while, Jane was determined to live for herself, to rediscover the passions and dreams she had put on hold for so long. Her awakening didn't happen in a single moment. It was a series of small steps, each one feeling like a new beginning. The first step was simple yet profound. She signed up for a yoga class. It had been years since she had done anything physical that wasn't related to taking care of someone else or managing household chores. Yoga was something she had always wanted to try but never had the time for. It felt like a small rebellion, a gentle push against the life she had been living, a way to reconnect with her body. The first class was both awkward and liberating. Jane struggled to follow the poses at first, feeling stiff and self-conscious, but as the hour went on, something began to shift. There was something about the stillness of the room, the rhythmic sound of breath, and the quiet moments of reflection that made her feel present in a way she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about the laundry, the dishes, or the never-ending list of things to do. She was simply in her body, focused on the moment. The sense of peace she felt during the class stayed with her long after it ended. When she stepped out of the studio, she felt a small flicker of excitement in her chest. This was only the beginning, but it was a step toward the life she had forgotten how to live. Over the next few weeks, Jane continued going to yoga. She began to feel more flexible, both physically and emotionally. The aches in her body, those physical reminders of the years spent in a constant state of stress and exhaustion, slowly started to ease. She also started noticing how much she had neglected herself in the past. She had always put everyone else's needs first, her husband's, her children's, her parents', her friends', but now, she was learning to take time for herself. It felt like a quiet revolution. In addition to yoga, Jane started reading again, something she had once loved but had abandoned in the chaos of family life. She picked up books about self-discovery, personal growth, and oddly enough, about women who had gone through similar experiences of rediscovery. One book in particular, Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, resonated deeply with her. The stories in the book spoke to something deep within Jane, reminding her of the wild, untamed part of herself she had silenced over the years. She began to see her own life through a new lens, one of possibility, change, and renewal. But as Jane embraced this new journey of self-discovery, she was also forced to confront the reality that not everyone in her life was on board with her transformation. Tom, in particular, was struggling. He had noticed the changes in her almost immediately, but unlike Jane, he wasn't ready to embrace them. He had always been content with their routine, their quiet life together. The idea of change, especially the kind of change Jane was seeking, made him uneasy. At first, Tom didn't say much. He simply looked at her with a confused expression when she mentioned her yoga classes or her new books. He didn't understand why she was so focused on herself all of a sudden. They had always shared everything, and now it seemed like Jane was pulling away, focusing on things that didn't involve him or the family. She began to feel a growing tension between them, one that she hadn't experienced before. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jane sat down on the couch with a cup of tea. Tom was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and the kids were doing their homework at the table. It was a familiar scene, but tonight it felt different. Jane's mind was racing with thoughts of her yoga practice, the books she had been reading, and the plans she was starting to make for herself. It wasn't that she wanted to leave Tom or her family behind, it was that she wanted to rediscover herself, to feel alive again. As she sipped her tea, she realized that she couldn't continue to ignore the tension that had been building between her and Tom. The truth was, she was afraid. Afraid that Tom wouldn't understand her need for change, afraid that he might resent her for it. She was also afraid that she might lose him, that the very foundation of their marriage could crack under the weight of her transformation. Just as Jane was lost in these thoughts, Tom walked into the living room. He stopped in his tracks when he saw her sitting there, a thoughtful expression on her face. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Jane hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. But then, something inside her shifted. She realized that if she didn't begin to speak her truth, she would only continue to feel trapped. Slowly, carefully, she began to open up. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've realized that I've lost myself somewhere along the way. I've spent so many years focusing on everyone else, on being a wife and a mother, that I've forgotten who I am. I need to change, Tom. I need to find myself again." Tom's face softened, but there was a look of confusion in his eyes. He didn't respond right away, and Jane could feel the weight of the silence hanging between them. "I'm not saying I want to leave or that I'm unhappy with you," she continued. "I just need to do this for me. I need to reconnect with who I am, beyond being a wife and a mother." Tom sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't understand, Jane. I don't know what you mean by finding yourself. Everything was fine before. Why can't things just stay the same?" "I don't want things to stay the same," Jane replied quietly. "I want to feel like I'm more than just a routine. I want to feel alive again." There was a long pause, and Jane could see the conflict in Tom's eyes. He didn't know how to respond, and for the first time in a long time, Jane felt a deep, gnawing sense of uncertainty. Would Tom support her in this new phase of her life, or would her desire for change tear them apart? The fear of the unknown loomed large, but Jane knew one thing for sure: she had already taken the first step. And no matter what happened, she couldn't go back. Jane's decision to embrace change had ignited something inside her, something she couldn't ignore. But as much as she was ready for this new chapter of her life, she quickly realized that change wasn't always welcomed by those closest to her. The person who struggled the most was Tom. At first, his reactions were subtle, small comments here and there, hints of frustration that he didn't know how to fully express. But soon, those subtle hints turned into something much more significant. Jane could feel the distance growing between them, like an invisible barrier forming with each passing day. He no longer smiled at her when she came home from yoga, no longer asked about her day or seemed interested in the new books she had been reading. Instead, he seemed distant, almost resentful, as though her self-discovery was a betrayal of the life they had built together. One evening, as Jane came home from a particularly long day at work, she found Tom in the kitchen, his back to her as he prepared dinner. She could tell immediately that something was off. There was a tension in the air, thick and suffocating, and Jane's heart sank as she approached him. "Hey," she said softly, placing her purse on the counter. Tom didn't turn around. "Hey." The silence hung between them like a heavy fog. Jane knew this wasn't just about dinner, this was something deeper. "Tom, what's going on?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "We haven't talked in a while." Tom finally turned to face her, his expression tight. "I don't know, Jane. I just don't get it. You're changing, and I'm not sure I like it." Jane blinked, surprised by the force of his words. "What do you mean?" "You're different. You're always out at yoga, reading those books, talking about all these self-discovery things. It's like you've completely forgotten about the life we built together. You're not the woman I married anymore." The words hit Jane like a punch to the stomach. She wasn't sure whether it was the anger in Tom's voice or the sadness in his eyes that cut the deepest. It wasn't that he didn't love her, she knew he did, but he was afraid. Afraid of what her changes might mean for them. "I haven't forgotten about us, Tom," Jane replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need to find myself again. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when I feel like I've lost who I am." Tom's face tightened with frustration. "But we're fine, Jane. I'm fine. The kids are fine. Why can't that be enough for you?" Jane felt a knot form in her chest. She had expected resistance, but not like this. She hadn't realized just how deeply Tom's fear of change ran, how much he valued their stable, predictable life. To him, everything was fine because he didn't know what else to want. He didn't see the cracks in their relationship, the emotional distance that had grown between them over the years. "I'm not saying I'm unhappy with you, Tom," Jane said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just need to feel like myself again. I need to reconnect with the woman I was before all of this. I've been so focused on taking care of everything and everyone else, but I've forgotten about me. And I can't keep going like this." Tom ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with his emotions. "I don't understand, Jane. I don't know how to fix this, how to fix you. All of a sudden, you're so different. What am I supposed to do with that?" Jane felt her heart break a little more with each word. She hadn't expected Tom to understand immediately, but she had hoped that he would at least try. She didn't want to lose him, but at the same time, she couldn't keep living in a way that made her feel invisible. She couldn't deny the truth any longer. The woman she had become wasn't the woman she wanted to be. But how could she move forward with her journey of self-discovery when Tom couldn't accept it? The next few days were tense. Jane continued her yoga classes and her reading, but Tom's silent resentment lingered in the background. He wasn't outwardly angry anymore, but his passive withdrawal from her felt like an ever-present wall between them. He no longer participated in the little things they used to share, dinner conversations, weekend walks, or even simple moments of affection. Jane missed the man who used to smile at her with genuine warmth, the one who shared her excitement for the future. Now, it felt like they were strangers living in the same house. During one particularly quiet evening, Jane decided to have another conversation with Tom. She couldn't ignore the growing tension any longer. Sitting down on the couch, she looked at him, her heart aching. "I know this isn't easy, Tom," she began softly. "But I need you to understand that I'm not trying to push you away. I'm not abandoning our life together. I just need to find my own way. I need to do this for me." Tom sighed heavily, his eyes tired. "I don't know if I can handle this, Jane. I'm afraid of losing you. I don't know how to fix this, and I don't even know if I want to." Jane felt a chill run through her at his words. She had always feared this moment, when the chasm between them would become too wide to cross. She had never imagined that her journey to rediscover herself would create such a divide between her and Tom. "I don't want to lose you either," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep losing myself. I need you to see me, Tom. I need you to understand that this is something I have to do for me, not against you. It's not about leaving our life behind. It's about finally living the life I've been ignoring for so long." For a long moment, Tom didn't speak. The silence between them was deafening, and Jane could feel the uncertainty hanging in the air. She didn't know what the future held for their relationship, but one thing was clear: she couldn't go back to the way things were. No matter how hard it was, she had to keep moving forward, even if that meant walking through the pain of their distance. Tom finally spoke, his voice quiet and heavy with emotion. "I don't know if I can be the man you need right now, Jane. I just don't know. I don't know if I can be the woman I need to be without finding myself first," Jane replied softly. "I can't make any promises about what happens next, but I have to do this." And with that, Jane realized that the hardest part of this journey wasn't the physical changes she was making, it was the emotional distance she had to cross. It wasn't just about rediscovering herself, it was about whether her marriage could survive the transformation that was taking place. Would Tom accept the new version of her, or would the walls between them become too high to climb? Only time would tell. Days turned into weeks, and Jane continued her journey of self-discovery, but the weight of Tom's silent disapproval grew heavier with each passing day. Despite the tension in her marriage, Jane pressed forward, focusing on her yoga practice and immersing herself in the books that had once reignited a sense of purpose in her life. She began to understand more about herself, her desires, her fears, and the dreams that had been buried for far too long. But even as she embraced these changes, Jane couldn't help but feel a growing sense of isolation. Tom's emotional distance had become more pronounced, and their conversations had dwindled to brief exchanges about the kids, household chores, and nothing more. It was as though they had both retreated into separate worlds, one filled with Jane's quest for self-rediscovery and the other, Tom's world of denial and resistance. That was when Sarah, her longtime friend, called. Sarah had been with Jane through thick and thin, and their friendship had always been a constant in Jane's life. She was the one who had been there when Jane and Tom had met, the one who had held her hand through the birth of their children, and the one who had celebrated their milestones together. Over the years, their bond had grown deeper, and Sarah had witnessed the subtle shift in Jane's life long before Jane had fully understood it herself. When Sarah heard about Jane's struggles, she didn't waste any time. She invited Jane over for coffee, knowing that her friend needed someone to listen, someone who understood. Jane had always been there for Sarah during her own difficult times, and now it was her turn to offer the same. As Jane walked into Sarah's cozy kitchen, she was immediately enveloped in the warmth of her friend's presence. Sarah had always been the kind of person who made you feel safe, like nothing in the world could hurt you when you were with her. She was a calming force, and Jane needed that now more than ever. "Come on in," Sarah said, her smile wide as she motioned toward the table. "I made coffee, and I've got a chocolate cake in the oven. I think it's exactly what you need." Jane smiled weakly, grateful for the familiar comfort of her friend's company. She sat down, her hands wrapped around the warm mug of coffee Sarah had placed in front of her. "I don't know what to do anymore, Sarah," Jane admitted, her voice soft and filled with frustration. "Tom is just not getting it. He doesn't understand why I need to change. It feels like we're drifting farther apart every day. I don't even know if he'll ever accept the person I'm becoming." Sarah listened quietly, her eyes filled with understanding. She knew how much Jane had invested in her marriage, how deeply she had loved Tom. But she also knew how important it was for Jane to reconnect with herself, to find the woman who had been lost in the roles of wife and mother for so long. "I've been there, Jane," Sarah said after a long pause. "I've been in a relationship where I was so focused on everything and everyone else that I completely lost myself. It's suffocating. And I know it's hard for Tom too. He's afraid. He doesn't know how to deal with you changing, and he probably feels threatened by it. But this isn't about him. It's about you finding your voice, your strength." Jane felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the vulnerability she was showing. "But what if this tears us apart, Sarah? What if the more I change, the further we get? I don't want to lose him, but I can't keep ignoring what I need." Sarah reached across the table, gently taking Jane's hand in hers. "I know you don't want to lose him. But you can't lose yourself, either. You deserve to feel alive again, to feel like you matter as more than just a wife or a mother. You matter as Jane, as the woman you were before all of this." "I just feel so alone in this," Jane whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's like no one really understands." "You're not alone," Sarah replied softly. "I'm here. And you'll find other women who understand too. You just need to let yourself reach out." Jane sighed, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the past few months. She had felt so isolated, so unsure of who she was becoming. But Sarah's words were like a light in the darkness, offering her a path forward, one where she didn't have to carry this burden alone. Sarah continued, "You don't have to do this by yourself, Jane. There are support groups, workshops, places where women like us come together to share our stories and lift each other up. You deserve that, Jane. You deserve to find people who understand what you're going through." For the first time in weeks, Jane felt a sense of relief wash over her. It was as though a door had been opened, a door she hadn't even known was there. She had spent so much time focusing on her marriage and trying to make Tom understand that she had forgotten about the other relationships that could nourish her soul, relationships with other women who had walked similar paths. "I didn't even think about that," Jane admitted, a small smile forming on her lips. "Maybe I've been so focused on Tom that I've neglected the support I could find from others." "You've been so focused on being there for everyone else, Jane," Sarah said with a knowing look. "It's time for you to be there for yourself. You're not just a wife and a mother. You're a woman with your own needs, dreams, and desires. Don't forget that." Jane took a deep breath, her mind swirling with possibilities. Maybe she could join a support group. Maybe she could find a network of women who understood her struggles, women who were also on their own journeys of self-discovery. It felt like a lifeline, something that could help her stay grounded as she navigated the challenges in her marriage and her personal life. "Thank you, Sarah," Jane said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would do without you." Sarah smiled warmly. "That's what friends are for. And don't forget, if you ever need anything, I'm just a phone call away." As Jane left Sarah's house that day, she felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, that Tom's resistance would continue to challenge her, but she also knew that she didn't have to face it all in isolation. She had the support of friends, and she was beginning to see that there were others out there, other women, who had experienced the same struggles. And that thought, that sense of connection, gave Jane the strength to keep going. She was no longer just drifting through her life, she was starting to take control, to build the future she had longed for. The journey was far from over, but at least now, she knew she didn't have to walk it alone. As weeks turned into months, Jane's journey of self-discovery became both a source of strength and a source of pain. She had taken steps that she had once thought impossible, she had reconnected with her passions, focused on her own well-being, and most importantly, she had begun to live for herself. But the path wasn't as simple as she had hoped. Every victory came with its own set of challenges, and with every change, there were consequences. Tom, despite the occasional attempts to bridge the gap between them, continued to resist the changes in Jane. It wasn't just his confusion or his frustration, it was fear. Fear of losing the life he had known. Fear that the woman he had married, the one who had been his partner in building their family and their home, was slipping away from him. He had always been the steady one, the reliable one, and the emotional distance he had been creating between them wasn't just a passive reaction, it was a defense mechanism. The tension in their house had grown. Dinner conversations were sparse. Small gestures of affection, once a routine part of their daily lives, had become rare, if not non-existent. Tom had stopped asking Jane about her yoga classes or the books she was reading. He seemed to have distanced himself emotionally, his concern for her well-being masked by the resentment of the changes she was making. Jane, for her part, was no longer willing to suppress her own desires to accommodate him. She couldn't ignore the longing in her heart for a life that felt like her own. The yoga, the books, the late-night talks with Sarah, these things were filling a gap that had been empty for too long. But they came at a cost. The more she grew into herself, the more she felt the gulf between her and Tom widen. It was during one of these difficult nights, as Jane sat on the edge of their bed, that the full weight of the situation came crashing down on her. She had just returned from a workshop for women that had been transformative. She had met women from all walks of life who shared her experiences, her struggles, and her hope for change. The connection she had felt with them was unlike anything she had experienced in years. She had been energized, empowered, and ready to keep moving forward. But now, as she looked at Tom lying in bed next to her, she felt the quiet, painful tension between them. "Tom," she whispered into the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk?" Tom didn't immediately respond. He simply turned over, his back to her, staring out the window. Jane could see the muscles in his shoulders tense as he avoided looking at her. "I know things haven't been easy," she continued, trying to keep her voice calm. "But I need you to understand something. This isn't about you. It's about me. I can't keep living like I'm invisible. I can't keep pretending that I'm okay when I'm not. I need to do this for myself." Tom's voice came low and strained, but Jane could hear the emotion behind it. "I don't understand, Jane. I don't get why this is so important to you. You're changing, and I don't know who you are anymore." Jane swallowed hard, the sting of his words cutting deeper than she expected. "I'm still the same person, Tom. I'm just becoming who I was meant to be." I've lost myself for so long. And I need you to see that, to understand that I'm doing this because I need to feel alive again. I'm not asking for you to change, but I can't keep waiting for you to catch up with me." There was a long pause, the only sound the quiet hum of the night. Jane could feel the distance between them like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Finally, Tom spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't keep up with you, Jane? What if I don't want to change? What if this is just who I am now?" Jane felt a lump rise in her throat. The pain in Tom's voice was undeniable, but it didn't change the fact that her journey was her own. She had spent too long trying to be everything for everyone else, and now for the first time in years, she had to put herself first. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fair, but it was necessary. "I can't ask you to change, Tom," she said softly, her heart breaking with each word. "But I can't stop changing, either. I can't go back to the woman I was before, lost, invisible, suffocating in a life that wasn't truly mine." Tom didn't respond immediately. He simply lay there in silence, and Jane could feel the shift between them. It was subtle, but it was there. The unspoken understanding that they were no longer the same people they had once been. The love was still there, but it was different now. The connection had frayed, and it wasn't clear whether it could ever be repaired. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Jane spent more time outside the house, at yoga, at the bookstore, at coffee shops, anywhere she could find solace. She began to feel more like herself, but the price of her freedom was becoming painfully clear. Her marriage, once the foundation of her life, was teetering on the edge. She couldn't ignore the guilt that gnawed at her. She didn't want to lose Tom, but she also knew that she couldn't keep sacrificing her happiness for the sake of keeping things the same. One evening, after another quiet dinner where Tom barely spoke to her, Jane made a decision. She couldn't keep going like this, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. She had to take another step, one that she wasn't sure she was ready for, but one that she knew was necessary. "Tom," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I think we need to take a break. Just, for a little while. I need to figure out who I am, what I want. I can't keep living like this, and I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I need space to grow, to figure out where we go from here." Tom looked up at her, his face a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "You want a break? From us?" Jane nodded, feeling the weight of the decision in her chest. "Yes. I need to figure things out, Tom. I need to find myself before I can figure out what I want in this marriage. We're both so lost right now, and I don't think either of us can keep going like this." There was silence again, heavy and suffocating. Jane could feel the tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. She couldn't let her emotions take over now. This was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she knew it was the only way. Tom stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know what to say, Jane. I don't know if I can be the man you need me to be." And with those words, Jane realized that the road ahead was going to be even harder than she had anticipated. The price of her freedom was higher than she could have imagined. But in the deepest parts of her heart, she knew it was the only path she could walk. The future was uncertain, but Jane had already taken the first step. She was learning to live for herself, even if it meant facing the painful consequences of her choices. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't go back. Jane's decision to take a break from her marriage was a turning point, but it wasn't a simple one. The quiet days that followed were filled with a mixture of fear, uncertainty, and the weight of guilt. At first, Tom had been silent, withdrawn. He didn't protest or argue when Jane suggested they take a step back. Instead, he retreated into himself. Jane could feel the coldness between them like a thick, unbreakable wall. His silence felt like a quiet accusation, a subtle judgment. He was hurting, and she could see it, but she couldn't bring herself to go back. She couldn't go back to a life of self-neglect, of lost identity. The first week of their separation felt like an endless stretch of time. Jane stayed in the house, but it felt hollow. The empty spaces in their home mirrored the empty spaces she had felt inside herself for years. She moved through the rooms mechanically, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, but none of it felt real. She was still haunted by the nagging thought that, despite all of her efforts to find herself, she was still failing her family. She still had so much to give them, but now in her new pursuit of self-fulfillment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being selfish. Tom hadn't left the house, though they no longer shared the same bed. He spent most of his time in the garage, tinkering with the car or working on odd jobs around the house. Jane often saw him through the window, but they didn't speak much. When they did talk, it was to discuss the kids, household matters, or the day-to-day logistics that still had to be managed. There were no conversations about feelings, about their marriage, or about their future. It was as though they had entered a strange, suspended state, waiting for something to shift, for someone to make the next move. The children had noticed the change, of course. They had sensed the tension between their parents, the quiet, the unease. Their youngest, Lily, had asked Jane one evening, as she was tucking her into bed, "Mom, why is Dad sleeping in the other room? Is everything okay?" The question hit Jane harder than she expected. She had wanted to protect them from the growing distance between her and Tom, but how could she shield them from something so real? "Everything is fine, sweetheart," Jane had replied, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Mom and Dad just need a little time to figure some things out. But we're still a family, okay? Nothing has changed about that." But even as she reassured her daughter, Jane knew that everything had changed. Her heart ached at the thought of how this might affect her children in the long run. They had always prided themselves on being a solid, united family. What would this break do to them? What would it do to Tom, and to herself? As the days passed, Jane found herself questioning everything she had done so far. Was her desire for personal growth worth the cost of the marriage she had spent years building? Every time she thought she had made the right choice, the guilt would set in again. She missed Tom, his presence, his laughter, the way they used to talk late into the night. But even as she missed him, she couldn't ignore the fact that she had been living in a constant state of suffocation for far too long. One evening, as Jane was sitting alone at the kitchen table, looking through some of the old photo albums they had collected over the years, a sudden, sharp thought hit her. What if her desire to change was tearing everything apart for nothing? What if she had made a mistake, expecting too much from herself and Tom? What if she was being selfish by wanting to find herself again? She thought back to the early days of her marriage, the days when everything felt effortless, when she and Tom were in sync, working toward the same goals. How had they gotten here? When did they stop being the couple who dreamed together, who loved each other fiercely? When did she stop being the woman who was truly present, who saw herself as more than a caretaker? The thoughts swirled in her mind, leaving her feeling more confused than ever. But just as quickly as the doubt crept in, Jane reminded herself of something she had learned in her yoga classes. She couldn't live her life based on what-ifs. She couldn't keep questioning her worth or her choices. She had to move forward, no matter how painful it was. The next morning, Jane decided it was time to confront the truth. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, neither fully in her marriage nor fully in her journey of self-discovery. She needed to talk to Tom, to tell him where she stood, and to see if there was a way forward together. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to move beyond the silence. She waited until the kids had left for school, and then, with a deep breath, she walked into the garage where Tom was working. He looked up at her as she entered, his face unreadable. "Tom," she began, her voice steady but soft, "we need to talk." Tom put down the wrench he had been holding and wiped his hands on a rag. "About what?" he asked, not meeting her eyes. "I can't keep living like this, Tom," Jane said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I'm not asking you to change, but I can't stay stuck in this place where I'm not living for myself. I need to keep moving forward with my life. But I need to know, do you even want to try to make this work?" Tom took a step back, as though the question had caught him off guard. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Jane could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the man he had been and the man he was afraid of becoming. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I don't know, Jane. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be the man you need me to be. I don't know if I can change. But I don't want to lose you either." Jane's heart twisted in her chest. The words she had feared hearing for so long were finally out in the open. Tom didn't know if he could change. He didn't know if he could meet her halfway. And Jane didn't know if she could keep sacrificing herself in a relationship that seemed to be slipping away. But in that moment, Jane realized something that she hadn't fully understood before. She couldn't control what Tom was willing to do. She couldn't force him to change. She could only control her own actions. And the only thing she could do was continue moving forward, continuing her own journey, whether or not Tom joined her. "I can't wait for you to change, Tom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to keep moving forward. But I still want to fight for us, if you do. I'm not giving up on us, but I can't stay where I am anymore. I just need to know if you're willing to try with me." Tom looked at her, his expression filled with sorrow, but also something else, something that resembled hope, though it was faint. "I don't know if I can change, Jane," he repeated, his voice strained. "But I don't want to lose you either." And so, the real work began. Neither of them had all the answers, and neither of them was sure where this journey would take them. But Jane knew one thing: this was the moment where she had to decide whether she would keep fighting for a relationship that might no longer exist in the way she had hoped, or whether she would let go and embrace the life she had begun to build on her own. The choice was hers, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. The weeks following Jane's conversation with Tom were filled with an uneasy silence. They continued to coexist in the same house, passing each other like strangers, their interactions limited to the most necessary exchanges. It was as though they were both waiting for something to shift, for a sign that would guide them forward. But each day felt like an endless repetition of the last, a slow, painful drift that seemed beyond either of their control. For Jane, the internal battle had become unbearable. On one hand, she wanted to believe that love could overcome this rift, that Tom and she could somehow return to the way things once were, that they could rebuild the connection that had been lost. On the other hand, she knew in her heart that the woman she was now, the woman who was rediscovering herself, who was no longer willing to stay silent and invisible, could not go back to being the woman she had been in the past. She had grown too much, changed too deeply. The woman who had been buried under the weight of family duties and societal expectations could never be resurrected. Tom, too, had changed. The man who once held her hand and whispered promises of forever was now a shadow of his former self, withdrawn and unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic. Jane could see the pain in his eyes, but it was unclear whether it was pain from his own internal struggles or from seeing her so different, so far away from the woman he had once loved. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Jane found herself sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the quiet street. The house was still, the only sound coming from the ticking of the clock on the wall. She had spent so much time trying to decide what she wanted, what she needed, but now in the silence of the night, she felt lost again. She had made so many changes in her life, and yet the questions about her marriage remained unanswered. Was she willing to sacrifice her own happiness for the sake of saving a relationship that had become more of a partnership than a marriage? Was she willing to accept a life where she continued to suppress her desires and dreams in order to maintain a semblance of peace with Tom? But even as these questions swirled in her mind, Jane knew the truth deep down: she couldn't keep living in a place of uncertainty. She couldn't keep holding on to a marriage that was no longer serving her, no longer making her feel whole. She had already spent too many years doing that. She had already sacrificed so much of herself to keep the peace, to keep the family intact. But now, she was finally beginning to understand that the most important relationship she needed to nurture was the one she had with herself. With a deep breath, Jane made the decision. She needed to let go. She needed to let go of the expectation that things would go back to the way they were. She needed to stop fighting for something that was no longer there and start fighting for her own happiness, her own peace. It was time to stop waiting for Tom to change, to accept that their marriage might no longer look the way she had once hoped it would. The next morning, Jane asked Tom to sit down with her. She had been dreading this moment, but she knew it was necessary. She needed to speak her truth, to let him know that the journey she had started was not one that she could walk alone anymore. She had been living in limbo for far too long, and now, she had to make a choice for herself. Tom looked at her as she sat down across from him, his face worn with the weight of their silence. He had clearly been expecting this conversation, but he didn't know what to say. "I've spent so many months trying to make sense of all of this," Jane began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Trying to figure out what's best for us, for the kids, for our family. But I can't keep pretending that things are fine when they're not. I can't keep going through the motions, trying to fix something that isn't working." Tom didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, his face expressionless but filled with a quiet sorrow. "I've changed, Tom. I've rediscovered parts of myself that I had buried for so long. And I can't ignore that anymore," Jane continued, her voice stronger now. "I need to keep growing, to keep moving forward. But I don't think we can keep doing this together. I don't think we can go back to the way things were. We've both changed, and I think we need to face that." Tom's eyes filled with sadness, but there was no anger, no frustration in his gaze. Instead, there was a deep sense of resignation. "I don't want to lose you, Jane," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can keep up with the changes you're making. I don't know if I can be the man you need me to be." Jane felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she knew that this was the truth. This was the moment where they both had to face the reality of their relationship, the reality that sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between two people who had grown in different directions. "I don't know if I can keep living like this, Tom," Jane said, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can keep waiting for things to change when I've already changed. I need to let go. I need to find myself fully, even if it means losing what we once had." There was a long silence between them, a silence that seemed to stretch out endlessly. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice quiet but resigned. "I don't want to lose you, Jane," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "But I understand. I don't know if I can change, either. And I don't think I can keep holding on if you're not the same person I married." And in that moment, Jane realized that the hardest part of this journey wasn't the change she had made for herself, it was the decision to let go of the life she had known. It was the decision to accept that sometimes, love wasn't enough. Sometimes, two people had to separate in order to save themselves. The tears came then, but Jane didn't try to stop them. She had spent so many years holding back her emotions, trying to please everyone else, trying to hold her family together at the expense of her own happiness. But now, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the sadness, the grief, and the freedom of finally making a decision for herself. "I'll always love you, Tom," she whispered through her tears. "But I need to love myself first." Tom nodded, his own tears glistening in his eyes. "I know, Jane. I know." As Jane walked away from that conversation, she felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and heartache, but it was also filled with possibility. For the first time in years, she felt like she was on the right path. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she was finally free to live her life on her own terms.